Hello and welcome to Bearing Reality. This is a channel that I've wanted to get going for quite some time now, and going into the new year, I'd like to use it as an outlet for some of my own interests in ethics and politics, metaphysics, theology, philosophy of religion, just philosophy in general, right? I'm a former philosophy student, about 3 years removed from university, and I'd love to go back and continue my education at some point. But in the meantime, as I just kind of work and try to keep the lights on and the heat going, food in my stomach and all that, I'm just reading and writing a bit, trying to share some knowledge with other people and learn a thing or two in the process. Bearing Reality itself is an homage to T.S. Eliot. In his Burnt Norton, he says, "Humankind cannot bear very much reality." And that is a fact that I think is backed up pretty well in biblical sources as well as secular sources, right? God says, "Man cannot see my face and live." And what does that mean? We're finite, we're limited, and we're not able to contain the vast reality of the divine nature. And in a secular sense, the same thing is true, right? We are limited, we're finite, and we're faced with a near infinity of information in the universe, right? We can't contain all of it. We can't grasp all of it. And if you want to take the absurdist route, like Albert Camus does, that's a contradiction, a tension that we have to live with. We're finite, we're limited, we seek for the infinite, and in his view, we can't have it. That tension pushes us on the path to knowledge, and that's just something that I'm very passionate about. Being as honest with ourselves, as clear-sighted as possible, to the extent that we can. In this channel, again, we'll be talking about some different thinkers, some different books, and it'll be a little more structured as time goes on. But to get things started out, I want to just talk about a key idea that I found while reading through Camus' Plague. So this is a book that was very influential in my own thinking. I first picked it up after COVID began. I've read it about 5 times since then. I've read it in English, I've read it in French. It's a phenomenal, phenomenal novel, and in my estimation, Camus' best work by far. A lot of people will reference the myth of Sisyphus or L'Étranger. Honestly, The Plague is far superior to both of them, in style and in substance. This is just going to pick up on one key theme that I found. But as a bit of background, Albert Camus, of course, the great French-Algerian philosopher of the 20th century, very, very fascinating figure, someone who himself led a life of contradictions, right? But in my view, the key to understanding Camus is understanding the fact that he is a disciple of St. Augustine. And that's controversial because I know a lot of people, a lot of Camus fans are probably not so inclined to the more Christian background to his thinking. But the fact is, Camus studied Augustine and the early Christian tradition quite extensively when he was in university. He did his master's thesis on Augustine's metaphysics, and so we have to view Camus through the lens of Augustine. And the themes that he's writing about come right off the pages of the Confessions, you know? Although he's grappling with it through a secular point of view, the themes are Augustinian to the core. We'll get into that a little more later. There's a lot of videos that I could do just talking about why I think that's the case, but at least in my interpretation of him, you have to understand that I am viewing it through that lens. Camus is thoroughly modern. He's thoroughly postmodern too, but he's also drawing upon a much older tradition, one that predates liberalism by far, and one which I think will probably outlast it. The Plague itself is a novel that takes place in what I assume is 1940s French Algeria, in a city called Oran, and this is a place where the bubonic plague has mysteriously appeared after being vanquished for quite some time. And it focuses on a doctor named Bernard Rieu and his companions and colleagues as they try to contain and fight the plague. But as we learn very quickly, there is no stopping it, right? The plague cannot be contained. It's going to find its way through the cracks, and there's really nothing we can do to stop it. There's a serum that can be administered to kind of mitigate some effects, but at the end of the day, whether one lives or dies is probabilistic, and nobody really knows. You have to wait and see. And for Rieu, who's a very practical, pragmatic man, someone who's very materialistic and just kind of focused on the task at hand, this is a huge problem for him. And how he grapples with it throughout the novel is very fascinating to me. I think in general, Rieu probably speaks for Camus more than anyone else, but one of his friends, the closest thing that he has to a best friend, is JeanTau, and he, I think, is at times even a better mouthpiece for Camus than Rieu is. A lot of people kind of debate what the plague represents. Is it death? Is it mortality? I think that there's something to that for sure. You can read it as being death and mortality, without a doubt. But There's also other interpretations. The plague represents Nazi Germany, and so this is all about the French capitulation and the Vichy regime. I don't think that's necessarily the case. That's too particular. In my reading of it, the plague represents the human capacity for moral failure. This is something that we all have, and whether you want to call it original sin, inherited guilt, or maybe just kind of a natural tendency that we have to do the wrong thing, this is what Camus is addressing. How do we grapple with that in an absurd world? What do we do to stop it, or at least mitigate the effects? And that's kind of where the plague takes us. I think that is the most evident interpretation, especially when you take into account some of Tarrou's own monologues later on. But suffice it to say, we are not just talking about a literal plague that's infecting a city. We're talking about the evil that is lurking within the hearts of everyone within it and everyone on the world. So, on that very light note, I do want to go to a quote by Dostoyevsky, and this comes from the Brothers Karamazov, a very, very good novel. It's pretty early on. The elder Zosima is addressing a woman of little faith, and after she brings her concerns to him, he kind of gives his advice, and he says, "If you do not attain happiness, always remember that you are on a good path, and try not to leave it. Above all, avoid lies, all lies, especially the lie to yourself. Keep watch on your own lie and examine it every hour, every minute." So Dostoyevsky was a very large influence on Albert Camus, and so I think you'll understand why this quote is relevant as time goes on here today. But it's just important to remember, right? If you do not attain happiness, remember you're on a good path, stick to it, and avoid lies. So, with that being said, with that thought in mind, let's keep going. JeanTau, like I said, I think is in some sense the absurd hero of the plague, even more so than the main character, who we later find out is the narrator, Bernard Rieu. Tarrou has very high aspirations. Like Rieu, he's very pragmatic, he's very focused on the task at hand, and that's why he does work so hard with Rieu to try and combat the plague. But whereas Rieu is more concerned with just being a man, he's a man of science, he's a doctor, he just wants to cure people and be done with it, nothing more to be said. Tarrou is looking to a higher ideal. He's also a materialist, metaphysically speaking. He doesn't believe in God, but he does see these transcendent values that motivate the work that they're doing, and this is something that he clings to throughout the story. And this kind of came to him early on in his life when he went to work with his father, who's a prosecutor, and he saw his father push for the death penalty for a criminal, and this was something that changed him forever. He was horrified. His father was a decent man by all accounts. Sure, he had some marital infidelities, but an upstanding citizen, a good prosecutor, someone that everybody admired, and yet he saw his father, this decent man, decent, quote-unquote, go and try and push someone to their death, right? And that never left him. So how do decent people do such horrendous things? He thought that his father was blind. Even though he seemed to be intelligent and decent, he was unable to see reality for what it was, whereas Tarrou could, and in so doing, he knew that he had to act differently. And so throughout his entire life, he's a man of contradictions, an atheist who wants to be a saint, which we'll talk about here in just a second. But his commitment to honesty is what motivates him. He wants to be honest with himself and honest toward others. In short, he wants to see the world as it is without any illusions. He says at one point toward the end, "I had the plague already, long before I came to this town and encountered it here," which is tantamount to saying, I'm like everybody else. Only there are some people who don't know it, or feel at ease in that condition. Others know it and want to get out of it. Personally, I've always wanted to get out of it. And he goes on, "We can't stir a finger in this world without the risk of bringing death to somebody. Yes, I've been ashamed ever since. I have realized that we all have the plague, and I have lost my peace." So, some people are aware that they have the plague, and some people are not. Some people construct all kinds of illusions for themselves to try and distract themselves from the fact that they're going to die, that they're capable of tremendous evil. And that's kind of the whole setting in the city before the plague. Camus talks about people who prefer sunbathing and swimming in the ocean over going to church or spending time with their family. These are very, very modern, liberal, enlightened people who don't have much time for anything apart from their own material satisfaction. When we get caught up in that, it's easy to bring the plague to other people. When we're not attentive, right, we're able to pass that on. And you can, again, look at it literally, right? If you're not paying attention and you have the virus, it's easy to spread it from person to person. But also, it's very easy to fall into injustice and dishonesty and this sort of thing. And so when Tarrou loses his peace, he realizes that he cannot be conformed to that sort of system, and he has to fight it with every ounce of his being. So that right there is just important to remember as we move on and kind of get to the key point that I want to make. So Tarrou says, "What interests me is learning how to become a saint." And Rio replies, "I feel more fellowship with the defeated than with saints. Heroism and sanctity don't really appeal to me, I imagine. What interests me is being a man." And then Tarrou says, "Of course a man should fight for the victims, but if he ceases caring for anything outside of that, what's the use of his fighting?" So Rio wants to heal people. Tarrou wants to heal people too, there's no doubt about it. I mean, it's so obvious from his entire life's work. He's trying to help others, but why, right? Why are we helping others? Why are we fighting for the oppressed? Why are we combating the plague? What is the higher ideal that's motivating it? What are we striving for? And so, as I see it, Ria has a very atomized existence. He doesn't see the bigger picture. He doesn't want to, because it's challenging. Tarrou, meanwhile, has a very narrative lens. He sees himself from the past to the present as kind of developing in a certain way, beginning really with his father and that prosecution. He's aiming at something. He's aiming at sainthood. He doesn't know exactly what that means. He doesn't believe explicitly, I would say, in the Christian ideal that's certainly in the background there, but that's kind of what he's going for. And eventually Tarrou does die. He's the last death of the plague in the book, as far as I can tell, if I'm remembering correctly, the last patient that Rio cares for anyway. He's lost so much, he's exerted so much energy and time and stress throughout this entire ordeal, and the final person to die when the entire city is celebrating the end of the epidemic, his best friend dies. Ria is wondering, did Tarrou attain happiness? Did he ever achieve that fulfillment, that peace that he longed for? And I think the answer depends on what we mean by happiness. Is it a kind of ecstatic, happy-go-lucky, optimistic attitude? The kind of thing that we might think of happiness, like we're just laying on a beach, drinking our mojitos or something all day? Like, probably not. That's clearly not what happened with him. He had a gruesome and painful death, laying in a bed. But if happiness is a matter of living a meaningful, virtuous life, even in spite of losing the battle, then I suppose he did. Rio is not so bold. He doesn't go one way or the other with it. But he says, and this is the narrator, Rio speaking in the third person, right? "The doctor could not tell if Tarrou had found peace now that all was over, but for himself he had a feeling that no peace was possible to him henceforth, any more than there can be an armistice for a mother bereaved of her son, or for a man who buries his friend. What good is an armistice that comes after a mother's only son has been killed in war, right? Okay, the battle's done, the war is finished, but she won't have peace, right? There will be no peace for her. And likewise for Dr. Ria, he's lost everything. At this point, he loses his best friend, his wife even. Everyone close to him, save his mother, is gone. And so the plague is done. Whether Tarrou found peace or not, to him, is kind of irrelevant because he won't, right? That option is off the table for Rio. And he goes on, "Tarrou had died this evening without their friendships having had time to enter fully into the life of either. Tarrou had lost the match, as he put it. But what had he, Rio, won? No more than the experience of having known plague and remembering it, of having known friendship and remembering it, of knowing affection and being destined to one day remember it. So all a man could win in the conflict between plague and life was knowledge and memories. But Tarrou perhaps would have called that winning the match." I want to read that again. "So all a man could win in the conflict between plague and life was knowledge and memories." So if at the end of the day the war cannot be won, and there is no overcoming that tendency toward evil or death, whatever the case may be, we can still get knowledge and memories out of it. And For Tarot, maybe that was winning. What's the significance of knowledge and memories here? Why is that winning the match? If at the end of the day we lose, if, like Zosima says, if we do not attain happiness, what good are knowledge and memories? Well, we'll get into that here shortly. Tarot had lived a life riddled with contradictions and had never known hope's solace. Did that explain his aspiration toward saintliness, his quest to peace by service in the cause of others? Perhaps. But as I see it, the value of knowledge and memory is kind of inseparable. I'm going to try to take it apart a little bit, but for Camus, knowledge is really central to ethics because our right action is a response to reality, right? And this is a very anti-modern or pre-modern view, I would say, that he's kind of inherited from the ancients and the medievals, whereby there is no distinction between is and ought, right? That's the whole analytic moral philosophy thing, where you can't get an ought from an is. You can't get value from fact, right? We can't look at something and know whether it's good or bad just by the fact that it exists, okay? We can't figure out how we are to respond to something just by the brute existence of it, okay? I think that's totally false. I have a number of reasons for thinking that. We could do videos on that later. But suffice it to say that Camus does not take that approach, right? He thinks that when we see reality correctly, clearly, with no illusions, no kind of smoke screen about it, like we just see things as they are, we will react accordingly, right? Knowledge is the path to virtue for him. And I got into a little discussion with a friend of mine on Facebook about this, and I was kind of defending Camus' position, and he accused me of being a Pelagian. And I think that if one takes the exact stance of Camus, an atheist, then yes, you kind of fall into a sort of Pelagianism. But I don't think that needs to be the case, right? You can factor grace into there too in the acquisition of knowledge, and kind of remedy that whole thing. The more we gain knowledge, and this isn't just like a list of facts, like memorizing information for a biology exam. That's not going to kind of give us ethical knowledge, but more or less the ability to see things as they are. That right there is knowledge, that right there is wisdom, and that's what enables us to live a good life for Camus. So he says, the good man, the man who infects hardly anyone, is the man who has the fewest lapses of attention, and it needs tremendous willpower, a never-ending tension of the mind to avoid such lapses. So, for him, attention is key. We have to see reality for what it is. We have to have a special kind of active, very willful, deliberate attention about us. So, trying to keep our eyes open, right? Never falling asleep, even for an instant. Never blinking. Staring unflinchingly at reality. This is how we prevent the plague. If we're always attentive, always conscious of our own capacity to spread it, then we'll be less likely to actually do so. And in my view, this is a very interesting idea that he probably inherits from Simone Weil, who he claims is the greatest mind of the century. Attention is really crucial to her, but for Weil, it's a negative sort of thing, right? Like when you're on a date with someone and you're not paying attention to them, how do you pay attention? You put your fucking phone away, right? Put the phone away, put all the distractions aside, and just exist in the moment with that person. And so that would be a more negative or passive approach. It's receptivity, right? Receptivity to the world, to the person in front of us. Whereas for Camus, it's not simply a matter of like putting the distractions aside, it's actively focusing. I think this can be traced back to their Augustinian influences, right? Because Simone Weil is, in some sense, a Christian. That's another matter. I'm going to do some videos on her later, but she adopts a very Christological worldview. For her, you can put that on grace, but for Camus, not so much. How is memory valuable, right, as opposed to knowledge? I think this is threefold. In the one sense, memory is a sort of sustenance that enables us to continue on. And I had a friend describe it as a kind of useful despair. So we think back at the past, and whether it's good memories that we don't have anymore, or bad memories that we're just recalling with shame, these are things that can motivate us to strive to make the future better. whether we're trying to reclaim the happiness that we had at one point in the past or avoid the pain and suffering and make it better for the future. These are kind of motivating factors that sustain us. Secondly, memory is also evidence of having lived, right? It's a form of knowledge. It's in the past, but if we didn't have those memories, where would the proof be that we lived in the first place? Like, if you're in a drunken state 24/7, you don't remember what happens the night before that. You're just kind of living a waking sleep, right? And in what sense are you living there? There's no evidence of that. There's no evidence that one has conformed to reality when there's nothing to remember it by. So, in a sense, having memories, cherishing memories, and looking back on them is a form of knowledge. It can become suffocating in the sense that we become caught up in them. We become completely captivated by the past. It can be a huge problem. And we can also remember back on things and kind of project an idealized version of the past that was not really the case. These are two temptations that I think go back to that quote by Dostoyevsky where it says, "Keep watch on your own lie." These are both kinds of delusions, self-inflicted lies that we have to keep watch on. Whether it's a relationship or just some event in our lives, we tend to think of the good at the expense of the bad, right? The bad memories hurt. They cause suffering even now. And so it's easy to just think about the good and draw upon that. But that's not keeping with reality. That is a form of lying. And so we have to have the clarity and the courage to just see things as they are and reflect upon them accordingly. And this leads us to self-knowledge, a sort of narrative clarity. We're storytelling creatures. We see things teleologically from start to finish, whether we want to or not. We try to live in the present, but we can't help looking to the past and the future. And so memories allow us a form of self-knowledge because our lives are a series of contingent events. They didn't have to be the case, but they were. And each one of them plays a role in developing our current present self. So the more we remember, the more clearly we remember and reflect, the better we'll know ourselves and kind of know where we're at and where we're going. And Augustine talks about this a lot in Book 10 of the Confessions, where for him, memory is a key part of pursuing happiness. And he gives an example of this where one asks two men if they want to serve in the military. One says yes, the other says no. But then you ask them both if they want to be happy or flourish or, something like that. Live meaningful lives if you prefer, eudaimonia. They're both going to say yes. So why would they answer differently to the first question and not the second? Contingent memories, right? One might have a certain history that predisposes them to take that path rather than the other. But at the end of the day, what they're aiming at is the same through different means. And figuring out what those means are for us to achieve that end goal is the value of memory, right? What it means for me or you or somebody else to be happy is going to come at a different cost, just depending on who we are, where we're at. I had a lot of quotes pulled from the Confessions, but I don't think we need to reference that. But something that Camus says earlier on in the book is that memory tends to fade. So people are living through the plague in the early days. They are trying to come to terms with the fact that they can't see their loved ones. They can't experience life as it was. And so they're drawing upon their memories to sustain them. And like I said, memory is a kind of sustenance, but for them, it eventually fades. And so he says, thus, while during the first weeks they were apt to complain that only shadows remained to them of what their love had been and meant, they now came to learn that even shadows can waste away, losing the faint hues of life that memory may give. And by the end of their long sundering, they had also lost the power of imagining the intimacy that once was theirs, or understanding what it can be to live with someone whose life is wrapped up in yours. So these are people who are rapidly losing hope. They have their memories, they're trying to cling to them, but the weight of the world is just too much. And this leads to what Camus calls the habit of despair. He says, naturally they had retained the attitudes of sadness and suffering, but they had ceased to feel their sting. Indeed, to some, Dr. Rio among them, this was precisely the most disheartening thing, that the habit of despair is worse than despair itself. Without memories, without hope, they lived for the moment only. Indeed, the here and now had come to mean everything to them, for there is no denying that the plague had gradually killed off in all of us the faculty, not only of love, but even of friendship. If memory and knowledge can serve as a sort of motivating factor, a sort of guiding light to achieving our goals. What do we do when they fade away, when knowledge fails, when memory disappears? How do you retain that? How do you retain the hope? And this is something that Camus grapples with throughout all of his work, right? How can you live without hope, and where do you find it at the end of the day? For Ria, the solution is to live in the contradiction, as Tarot did. But this, I think, is kind of a statement of faith. It's a leap of faith that can only be made by accepting that the world is good and worth living in. Because if it's not, then these people who are suffering without their loved ones in the plague would be better off killing themselves. However, that's not what Camus' position is. Ria is tempted by that. He says, and this is at the very end, right before the plague is completely finished, for the moment he wished to behave like all those others around him, who believed or made believe that plague can come and go without changing anything in men's hearts. Then, a little while later, I think this is actually on the very last page, he says, Ria knew that the tale he had to tell could not be one of a final victory. It could only be the record of what had to be done, and what assuredly would have to be done again in the never-ending fight against terror and its relentless onslaughts, despite their personal afflictions, by all who, while unable to be saints but refusing to bow down to pestilences, strive their utmost to be healers. This is a leap of faith. This is one who is accepting that the world is good and worth fighting for, that people are more good than evil, they are worth fighting and dying for. And that's not something that one can just deduce from the facts. Yes, Camus thinks that we can behave rightly by seeing reality, and I agree with that, but at the end of the day, that presupposes the fact that one accepts that the order of things is inherently good. Even in spite of the pain and suffering and evil, which makes absolutely no sense, is completely absurd, it's still worth existing here. And I don't think that Camus offers a good enough reason for that in Sisyphus. I know a lot of people really enjoy that work. I like it. I don't think it does the job. And I think that he's getting much nearer to the mark in The Plague than he is in Sisyphus. Why? If you'd have to go back to some of his dialogue with Father Penelou after Jacques Alphonse died, but he's very, very close to just saying, we need grace, right? And I guess for someone like Tarot or Ria, it doesn't make any sense. And that's where some of the contradiction lies, because he's striving to be a saint. He doesn't fully believe it, but he knows that he has to make that jump. And at least on the classic Christian account, that requires grace. So that's a very complex subject, and I don't have the means or the energy to go through it right now, I have to say. But I'd love to do a video or a couple videos on the interaction with Ria and Penelou earlier on in the book. Maybe we could get more into that. I'd have to do a little more thinking about that myself, just to come up with a good account of how grace plays into this. But I think that that's kind of where it takes us, right? The knowledge and memories motivate us. They lead us to work toward the future, to know ourselves better. And in that sense, even if we lose at the end of the day, we are still winning if that's what we gain out of it. So I'd be curious to know what you guys think about this, what you think the value of knowledge and memory is, whether I'm interpreting Camus right or not. I'd love to talk about that in the comments section. But if you enjoy the video, be sure to subscribe. I'll have more content on the way. I think next up I'm going to be talking about Simone Weil's essay, Dieu dans Platon, God in Plato, which is very fascinating, something from a new translation of her works that just came out a couple of years ago, and I'm really looking forward to that. But again, thank you for watching if you made it through to the end, and I will catch you guys in the next one. Peace.